The cold Chicago wind howling outside was nothing compared to the ice in Samuel Russo's veins. He was a man who ordered executions before his morning espresso. But when a shivering 5-year-old placed a crumpled dollar and some coins on his table, asking for soup, the ruthless boss broke. The neon sign of the Belmont Diner buzzed a relentless, flickering red against the rain-slicked pavement of Wabash Avenue. It was November, and Chicago was already biting down hard with a bitter, unforgiving frost. Inside a corner booth facing the door, Samuel Russo sat in absolute silence. At 34, Samuel was the undisputed head of the Russo Syndicate, a man whose name was spoken in hushed, terrified whispers from the South Loop all the way to the docks. He was dressed in a bespoke charcoal Brioni suit that cost more than the diner's annual rent, but if one looked closely, they would notice a dark crimson stain soaking into the pristine white cuff of his French cotton shirt. It belonged to Tommy the Rat Sullivan, a former associate who had just learned the hard way that crossing Samuel Russo was a terminal mistake. Samuel stared at his black coffee. His knuckles were raw. The adrenaline from the warehouse was fading, leaving behind the hollow, familiar emptiness that always followed the violence of his life. At the counter, his enforcer, a hulking wall of muscle named Leo, stood nursing a black tea, his eyes constantly scanning the street. The diner's owner, Old Man Pop, wiped down the counter with trembling hands, pretending his establishment wasn't currently occupied by the city's most dangerous apex predator. The brass bell above the diner door jingled violently. A gust of freezing wind swept into the diner, carrying with it a woman and a small child. The woman was rail-thin, drowning in an oversized thrift store trench coat that offered no real protection against the Chicago winter. Her hair was a damp, chaotic mess of chestnut curls, and her face was pale, hollowed out by exhaustion and fear. Clinging to her leg was a little girl, no older than 5, bundled in a faded pink snowsuit that was missing its zipper, held together instead by safety pins. Samuel barely glanced up. Desperation was a common stench in this part of the city. It wasn't his business. The woman dragged her feet to the counter. She didn't look at Samuel or Leo. Her eyes were locked pleadingly on the diner owner. Please. Her voice was a raspy whisper, broken by shivering. I can scrub the floors. I can wash every dish in the back. Just, please. We just need to sit where it's warm for an hour. And if you have any scraps, anything at all for my daughter. Pop cast a terrified glance towards Samuel's booth. In the Mafia boss's presence, the old man dared not breathe wrong, let alone run a charity kitchen. I can't, lady, Pop muttered, his eyes darting away. Health inspectors breathing down my neck. I ain't hiring, and I ain't giving out handouts. You gotta buy something or you gotta leave. The woman's shoulders collapsed. It was the physical manifestation of a soul breaking. Please, she choked out, a tear finally escaping and cutting a clean line through the dirt on her cheek. It's freezing out there. The shelters are full. Lady, I said no. Now please, step outside, Pop insisted, his voice tight with panic, while the mother desperately leaned over the counter, begging the owner in hushed, frantic tones. The little girl let go of her mother's coat. She had wide, impossibly green eyes, the kind of eyes that hadn't yet learnt how cruel the world was. She wandered away from the counter, her worn-out sneakers squeaking against the checkered linoleum. She bypassed the empty tables and walked straight toward the back corner, straight toward the man radiating an aura of absolute death. Leo immediately stiffened, his hand slipping inside his jacket to rest on the grip of his Glock 19. Samuel raised a single, scarred index finger. Stand down. Leo froze, stepping back into the shadows. The little girl stopped right at the edge of Samuel's table. She barely reached the top of the mahogany laminate. Samuel didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stared down at her, his dark, calculating eyes locking onto her innocent green ones. She didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into the deep, frayed pocket of her pink snowsuit. Her tiny hand emerged, clamped tight into a fist. She reached up, struggling to clear the edge of the table, and opened her fingers. Clink. Clatter. A severely crumpled, tear-stained $1 bill fell onto the table, accompanied by a sad assortment of loose change. Samuel's eyes automatically catalogued it. 4 dimes, 3 pennies, $1.43. The girl looked up at Samuel, her small chest rising and falling with cold, shallow breaths. Her lips were tinted a dangerous shade of blue. My mummy is crying because she's hungry, the 5-year-old said. Her voice was tiny, musical, but painfully weak. She pointed a small, trembling finger at the coins. I found this in the couch before we had to leave our house. I only have $1.43. Is that enough for soup? The silence that fell over the diner was deafening. The ticking of the clock on the wall sounded like gunshots. Leo, a man who had broken kneecaps without blinking, suddenly found himself staring at the ceiling, swallowing hard. Samuel Russo went completely still, the breath caught in his throat. For the first time in 10 years, the ruthless boss of the Chicago underworld felt a physical ache in his chest that had nothing to do with a bullet wound. He looked at the crumpled dollar bill, then at the 3 dirty pennies. Then he looked at the blood on his own cuff. The contrast was a violent collision of 2 entirely different universes. "What's your name, little bird?" Samuel asked. His voice, usually a rough, commanding gravel, was startlingly soft. "Lily," she whispered. Samuel slowly reached out with his large, ring-adorned hand. He didn't touch her. He gently pushed the small pile of coins back across the table toward her. "Keep your money, Lily," Samuel said, his eyes never leaving hers. "Tonight, the soup is on the house." "Lily!" The scream tore through the diner like shattered glass. Clara had finally realized her daughter was no longer by her side. She spun around, her heart stopping as she saw the tiny pink snowsuit standing next to the corner booth. But it wasn't just any booth. Even a desperate, starving woman knew the rumors of the South Loop. She saw the expensive suit, the terrifying stillness of the man, and the hulking shadow of the bodyguard standing nearby. Panic, absolute and primal, seized her. Clara sprinted across the diner, throwing herself between Samuel and the little girl. She snatched Lily into her arms, pressing the child's face into her shoulder as she backed away, her entire body shaking violently. "I'm sorry," Clara gasped out, her eyes wide with terror as she looked at Samuel. "I'm so sorry, sir. She doesn't know any better. We're leaving right now. We won't bother you again." She turned to flee, but a voice stopped her dead in her tracks. It wasn't loud, but it carried an authority that commanded the very air in the room to stand still. "Sit down." Clara froze. She slowly turned her head back. Samuel Russo was leaning forward, his forearms resting on the table. The soft, gentle demeanor he had shown the child was gone, replaced by the cold, calculating stare of a predator assessing its prey. "I said," Samuel repeated, gesturing to the empty booth opposite him. "Sit down." Clara wanted to run, but she knew if she bolted, the giant by the counter would catch her before she hit the sidewalk. Trembling, she clutched Lily tighter and slid into the vinyl booth across from the man. She kept her eyes glued to the table, terrified of meeting his gaze. Samuel studied her. He took in the hollowed cheeks, the bruised exhaustion under her eyes, the way her hands shook as she held her child. But as he stared, something clicked in the back of his mind. A file he had reviewed 6 months ago. A photograph clipped to a dossier about a missing $2 million. "Look at me," Samuel commanded softly. Clara slowly raised her eyes. "I know you," Samuel said, the pieces falling into place with a sickening thud. "You're Clara. Clara Hayes. Arthur Hayes' wife." Clara's breath hitched. All the blood drained from her already pale face. "How?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "How do you know my husband?" "Arthur was my accountant," Samuel stated plainly. Clara's eyes widened in sheer horror as the realization hit her. Arthur had always been secretive about his private firm's special clients. 6 months ago, Arthur had vanished in the middle of the night. A week later, the police found his car abandoned by the river, his body in the trunk, riddled with bullets. The detectives had whispered about organized crime, about mob hits. Clara had been evicted, her bank accounts frozen by federal investigations, chased by shadows ever since. "You," Clara choked on the word. "You're him. You're the one who killed him." Leo took a threatening step forward from the counter, but Samuel raised his hand again, stopping him instantly. "Arthur stole $2 million from my family." "Clara," Samuel said, his voice stripped of emotion. "He wired it to an offshore account and tried to run. I put out an order to find him, but I didn't kill him." Samuel leaned in closer, his dark eyes piercing through her. "The Callahan Syndicate found him first. The Irish wanted the money he stole from me. They tortured him, killed him, and dumped him. I assumed Arthur gave you the money before he died. I assumed you were sitting on a beach in the Caymans." Samuel looked down at the $1.43 still resting near the edge of the table. Then he looked at the safety pins holding Lily's coat together. "Clearly," Samuel murmured, a dangerous edge creeping into his voice. "I was misinformed." Clara was weeping silently now, Holding Lily so tightly the girl squirmed. "He didn't leave us anything," she sobbed, abandoning all pride in the face of death. "He just left. Men came to our house. Men with Irish accents. They tore the walls apart. They threatened to hurt Lily. We ran. We've been sleeping in a condemned building off 43rd Street. We haven't eaten in 2 days. Please. I don't know anything about the money. Just let us go." Samuel stared at her. In his world, weakness was a liability. Pity was a fatal flaw. He should let her walk out into the cold. If the Callahans were hunting her, associating with her would spark a gang war that Chicago hadn't seen in a decade. It was bad business. It was insane. Then, little Lily peeked out from her mother's shoulder. She looked at Samuel, her green eyes completely devoid of the fear that consumed her mother. She pointed a tiny finger at him. "Are you the soup man?" she asked innocently. The ice in Samuel's veins shattered completely. The ruthless Mafia boss. The man who held the city's corrupt politicians in his pocket and its criminals under his boot, felt a dangerous, terrifying instinct rise within him. The instinct to protect. Samuel looked up at Leo. "Leo, lock the front door, flip the sign to closed." Clara gasped, preparing for the end. "Pop!" Samuel barked over his shoulder. The old owner scrambled to attention. "Bring 2 bowls of your best chicken soup, extra noodles, then fire up the grill. I want steaks, mashed potatoes, fresh bread, bring everything you have." Pop didn't hesitate. "Yes, Mr. Russo, right away." Samuel turned back to Clara, who was staring at him in utter disbelief. He pulled a pristine silk handkerchief from his breast pocket and slid it across the table toward her. "Dry your eyes, Clara," Samuel said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly vow. "You aren't sleeping in a condemned building tonight. And as for the Callahans," Samuel's jaw tightened, a lethal fire igniting in his dark eyes. "They made a grave mistake hunting what belongs under my protection." He looked at the small pile of coins on the table. He reached out, picked up the $1.43, and carefully placed it in his own pocket. "The meal is paid for," Samuel said softly. "Now, eat." The ride from the Belmont Diner to the Gold Coast was a study in absolute silence, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the armored Cadillac Escalade and the soft, even breathing of little Lily, who had fallen asleep against Clara's side. The heater blasted warm air, a stark contrast to the freezing Chicago winds tearing at the tinted windows. Clara sat rigid, clutching her daughter. The sheer terror of the last few hours had crystallized into a numb, surreal exhaustion. Sitting across from her in the spacious cabin was Samuel Russo. He hadn't spoken since they left the diner. He merely watched the city lights bleed across the glass, his jaw clenched, the bloody cuff of his shirt hidden beneath his tailored jacket. Up front, Leo drove with mechanical precision, his eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirrors. They pulled into a subterranean private garage beneath a soaring glass high-rise. Samuel escorted them up a dedicated elevator that opened directly into a sprawling 2-story penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of Lake Michigan, churning violently in the winter night. The interior was modern, minimalist, and intimidatingly expensive slate floors, dark leather, and brushed steel. It didn't look like a home, it looked like a fortress. "Leo will show you to the guest wing," Samuel said, his voice flat but not unkind, breaking the silence as he unbuttoned his suit jacket. "There is a bedroom for you and Lily, connected bathroom. Lock the door if it makes you feel safer. No one will disturb you." Clara swallowed hard, pulling Lily's sleeping form higher into her arms. "Why are you doing this, Mr. Russo? If Arthur stole from you, if the Callahans are looking for me, keeping us here puts a target on your back." Samuel stopped, his back to her. He slowly turned around, the ambient city light casting deep shadows across his sharp, angular face. Arthur Hayes was a thief, Clara. He betrayed me, and in my world, betrayal is paid in blood. But you? You are a casualty of a war you didn't even know you were fighting. His gaze dropped momentarily to the small, frayed pink sleeve of Lily's snowsuit hanging over Clara's arm. "And I do not make war on 5-year-old girls with $1.43 to their name." Before Clara could respond, a heavy oak door near the foyer swung open. A man stepped out, impeccably dressed in a navy suit, holding an encrypted tablet. This was Dominic Costa, Samuel's underboss and chief strategist. Dominic was sharper than a scalpel, his mind a labyrinth of numbers, blackmail, and tactical maneuvers. Dominic took one look at Clara and the child, then looked at Samuel, his dark eyebrows pulled together in a harsh line. "Tell me you didn't, Samuel." "Take them to the guest wing." Leo, Samuel ordered, ignoring Dominic. Once Clara and Lily were safely down the hall and out of earshot, Dominic closed the distance between them. "Are you out of your mind?" he hissed, keeping his voice low. "We just finished cleaning up the mess with Sullivan at the warehouse. Declan Callahan's men are tearing up the south side looking for Arthur's widow, and you bring her to the penthouse. You brought the heat directly to our front door." Samuel walked over to a crystal decanter on a floating glass shelf and poured himself 2 fingers of scotch. "She's broke, Dominic. Sleeping in condemned buildings. Arthur didn't leave her a dime." "And you believe her?" Dominic countered, slamming the tablet onto a marble island. "Arthur wired $2 million out of our accounts. He didn't just burn it. The Callahans want that money, and they believe she knows where it is. If Declan finds out she's here, if Declan Callahan steps foot in my territory, I'll send him back to Dublin in a pine box," Samuel growled, turning to face his underboss, the glass in his hand trembling slightly with repressed rage. "You didn't see them, Dom. You didn't see the kid. Arthur sold his family to the wolves to save his own skin." "This isn't a charity, Samuel. It's a syndicate," Dominic warned, his voice grave. "You're letting sentimentality cloud your judgment. You've built this empire on being untouchable. If you protect her, Declan will view it as an act of war. He's already mobilizing his enforcers in Canaryville." Samuel took a slow sip of the scotch, the burn grounding him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled, stained dollar bill, setting it next to the 3 dull pennies on the pristine marble counter. The $1.43 looked entirely alien in the multi-million-dollar penthouse. "Then let it be war," Samuel said, his voice dropping to a lethal, ice-cold register. "Tell our captains to lock down the ports. Double the guard on the north side supply lines. If Declan Callahan wants a bloodbath over a ghost's missing millions, I'll drown him in it." The next morning, Clara awoke to the unfamiliar sensation of warmth. For the first time in 6 months, she wasn't shivering. She was buried under a mountain of heavy Egyptian cotton duvets in a bed large enough to fit 3 people. Beside her, Lily was sprawled out, her cheek pressed against the plush pillows, breathing peacefully. Memory rushed back, hitting Clara like a physical blow. The diner, the blood on Samuel's cuff, the terrifying reality that her husband's monstrous secret had finally caught up to them. She slipped out of bed, finding a plush white robe draped over an armchair. She walked into the massive ensuite bathroom to wash her face. As she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. Her cheekbones were sharp, her eyes sunken. She looked like a ghost. She walked back into the bedroom and picked up Lily's filthy, frayed pink snowsuit from the floor. It reeked of the damp alleyways and condemned squats they had inhabited. Clara decided she would wash it in the sink, anything to feel a sense of normalcy. She carried it into the bathroom and began to run warm water. As she submerged the coat, squeezing the cheap polyester, her fingers brushed against something hard near the inner lining of the right pocket. Clara frowned. She squeezed it again. It wasn't a button. It felt metallic, jagged, and entirely out of place. Her heart began to pound against her ribs. She grabbed a small pair of nail scissors from the vanity kit on the counter and carefully snipped away the torn fabric on the inside of the pocket. She reached in, her fingers trembling violently. She pulled out a small, heavy, brass key. Etched into the metal were 3 letters. First, Chicago Fidelity. Below that, a serial number, box 409. Clara's breath hitched, a cold sweat breaking out across the back of her neck. Arthur. It had to be Arthur. The night before he vanished, he had hugged Lily tightly, lingering for a long time. He had told Clara he was going out for cigarettes, but he had spent an unusual amount of time zipping up Lily's coat, kissing her forehead over and over again. He hadn't abandoned the money. He had hidden the access to it on the one person he thought no one would ever suspect, his 5-year-old daughter. "Oh my God," Clara whispered, the key digging into her palm. $2 million. The very thing the Irish mob was tearing the city apart to find, the very thing that had gotten her husband killed, had been bouncing around in her daughter's pocket while they starved on the streets. A soft knock on the bedroom door made her jump. "Clara." Samuel's deep, resonant voice echoed through the wood. "Breakfast is ready. If you and Lily are awake." Clara shoved the key into the pocket of her robe, her mind racing. Who could she trust? Samuel had saved them, fed them, clothed them. But he was a mafia boss. He was the man her husband had stolen from. If she gave him the key, would he just take his money and throw them back to the wolves? If she didn't give it to him, and the Callahans found them, they would kill Lily for it. She dressed quickly in some clean, oversized sweatpants and a t-shirt someone had left folded at the end of the bed. She woke Lily gently. 10 minutes later, they walked cautiously out into the massive living area. The scent of bacon, eggs, and freshly brewed coffee filled the air. Samuel was sitting at a massive glass dining table, drinking espresso and reading a newspaper. He had discarded the suit for a dark, fitted cashmere sweater, though the holster strapped across his chest was a glaring reminder of his reality. Lily didn't care about the holster. Her eyes widened at the spread of food. "Mummy, look!" Samuel lowered his newspaper. His dark, imposing features softened fractionally as he looked at the little girl. "Sit down, little bird. Eat as much as you want." As they ate, the penthouse elevator chimed. Dominic rushed in, his face pale, bypassing pleasantries entirely. He walked straight to Samuel, ignoring Clara and Lily. "We have a problem," Dominic said, his voice tight. 10 minutes ago, a drive-by at the Southside Distribution Center. 2 of our men are down, bleeding out. The shooters left a message painted on the loading dock doors. Samuel didn't flinch, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. What did it say? It said, "Give us Hayes' ghost, or Chicago burns." Dominic threw a glare at Clara. "Declan knows she's alive, and he knows she's under your umbrella. He's forcing your hand, Samuel." Clara dropped her fork, her stomach plummeting. The war had started, and she was the epicenter. Samuel stood up slowly, the sheer, violent power of the man radiating off him. "Double the guard downstairs. Pull the captains in. We hit Callahan's pubs tonight, all of them. Burn them to the ground." "Samuel, wait!" Clara shouted, standing up so fast her chair scraped loudly against the slate floor. Both men turned to look at her. Clara was shaking, tears welling in her eyes, but she reached into the pocket of her robe. She pulled out the small brass key and slammed it onto the glass table. The heavy clack echoed in the silent room. "It was in her coat," Clara choked out, pointing a trembling finger at Lily, who was happily oblivious, stuffing her face with a pancake. Arthur hid it in her snowsuit before he ran. "First Chicago Fidelity. Box 409. Dominic stared at the key as if it were a venomous snake. "The missing 2 million, he breathed. Samuel looked at the key, then up at Clara. His expression was unreadable. "You could have kept this hidden. You could have waited until we were dead, taken the money, and disappeared." "I don't want the blood money!" Clara cried out, her voice breaking. "It got my husband killed. It almost got my daughter killed. Take it. Take your $2 million. Just, please, don't let Declan Callahan take my little girl." Samuel walked around the table. He stood towering over Clara, his dark eyes searching her terrified face. He saw the raw, unfiltered honesty of a mother willing to burn down the world to protect her child. He reached out, but he didn't take the key. Instead, Samuel gently placed his large, rough hand against Clara's cheek, his thumb brushing away a stray tear. The touch was shockingly tender, sending a jolt of electricity straight through her chest. "Declan Callahan isn't touching you," Samuel whispered, a fierce, possessive fire igniting in his gaze. "The money settles Arthur's debt. But you and Lily? You belong to me now. And I protect what is mine." The heavy oak doors of the penthouse study clicked shut, sealing Samuel Russo inside with his top lieutenants. Clara stood in the hallway, holding her breath, the cold brass key still phantom heavy in her palm. She had handed over the very thing that had cost her husband his life, and in return, Samuel had declared war on the Irish mob. Inside the study, Dominic ran his hand over his face, staring at the brass key resting on the mahogany desk. $2 million, Samuel. It's sitting in a box at First Chicago Fidelity. We take it, we give Declan Callahan his cut to save face, and we hand over the widow. It's clean. It's business. Samuel stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the frozen expanse of Lake Michigan. He was wearing a fresh black Tom Ford suit, the fabric perfectly tailored to his wide shoulders, hiding the lethal weaponry strapped beneath it. "We are not handing over the widow, Dom," Samuel said softly, his voice devoid of its usual gravel, replaced by an eerie, absolute calm. "And we are not giving Declan a dime. Arthur Hayes was my man, and he stole my money. The debt is settled. But Declan crossed a line when he painted his threats on my doors and hunted a 5-year-old girl in my city." Leo, standing by the door like a gargoyle, cracked his knuckles. "So, what's the play, boss?" Samuel turned, his dark eyes locking onto his men. "Empty the box. Bring the cash to the secure vault at the South Loop warehouse. Then, call Declan. Tell him I have the missing millions, and I have the widow. Tell him I want a parlay tonight. Hangar 4 at Midway International. Dominic's eyes widened. Midway? Samuel, that's neutral ground. If you bring the woman there... I'm not bringing Clara, Samuel interrupted, a predatory smile touching the corner of his mouth. I'm bringing the entire Russo syndicate. Declan thinks he's cornered a businessman. Tonight, I remind him that he's cornered a monster. Hours later, the sun completely abandoned Chicago, plunging the city into a biting, wind-whipped darkness. Clara paced the slate floors of the penthouse, her heart hammering a relentless rhythm against her ribs. Lily was asleep on the massive leather sofa, a cartoon playing softly on the television. Clara had watched Samuel leave an hour ago. He hadn't said goodbye. He had simply paused by the door, looked at her with eyes that promised violence, and walked into the elevator. She knew what he was doing. He was stepping into the firing line for a woman he barely knew, all because of a crumpled dollar bill and 3 pennies. Miles away, the sprawling tarmac of Midway International Airport was slick with black ice. Hangar 4 was a cavernous, empty shell of corrugated steel and shadow. Inside, Samuel stood directly under a single halogen light, his breath pluming in the freezing air. Leo and Dominic flanked him, their hands resting casually inside their tailored coat. The screech of tires echoed through the hangar as 3 black SUVs rolled through the massive doors, their headlights cutting through the gloom. The doors slammed shut behind them, sealing the trap. Declan Callahan stepped out of the lead vehicle. He was a broad, red-faced man, wrapped in a heavy tweed overcoat, his eyes calculating and cruel. A dozen armed Irish enforcers fanned out behind him, their hands hovering over their holsters. Declan swaggered forward, stopping 10 feet from Samuel. Russo, he barked, his thick Dublin accent echoing off the steel walls. I see you finally found your senses. Where's the Hayes woman, and where's my money? Arthur Hayes stole $2 million from the Russo family, Samuel said, his voice echoing with absolute authority. That money has been recovered and secured. As for Arthur's widow and his child, they are under my personal protection. Declan's face darkened, the faux cordial demeanor vanishing. Are you thick, Samuel? Hayes promised that money to us before he got cold feet. You're shielding a dead man's whore and keeping what belongs to my family. Hand her over, or we start dropping your captains tomorrow. Samuel didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He slowly unbuttoned his suit jacket. You won't be dropping anyone, Declan. You brought 12 men to a parley. I brought 50. Before Declan could process the words, the shadows of the hangar came alive. From the catwalks above, the maintenance bays to the left, and the storage containers to the right, dozens of laser sights cut through the darkness, painting Declan and his men in a constellation of deadly red dots. The unmistakable sound of 50 assault rifles chambering rounds echoed like a thunderclap. Declan froze, the blood draining from his face. His men looked around in sheer, primal panic, realizing they had walked directly into an execution chamber. You threatened what is mine, Samuel said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the Irish boss. You hunted a starving mother and a child through the freezing streets of my city. You thought I was weak because I run a business. But this isn't a business, Declan, this is a kingdom. And you just stepped on the throne. Declan swallowed hard, his hands trembling as a red laser dot rested perfectly between his eyes. Samuel, wait. We can make a deal. We can split the money. There is no deal, Samuel whispered, stopping just inches from Declan's face. You have exactly 2 hours to pack your bags and take your men back to Dublin. If I see your face in Chicago after midnight, I will personally mount your head on the hood of my car. Do you understand? Declan nodded frantically, the fight completely broken out of him. I understand. Leave, Samuel commanded. The Irish mob scrambled back into their SUVs, the tires squealing as they fled the hangar, leaving the city of Chicago entirely to Samuel Russo. When Samuel returned to the penthouse, it was past midnight. The adrenaline was fading, leaving the familiar, hollow chill. He took off his suit jacket, tossing it over a chair. He walked toward the kitchen to pour a drink, but stopped dead in his tracks. Clara was standing in the dim light of the hallway. She looked at him, taking in the exhaustion etched into his sharp features, the coldness lingering in his eyes. She knew what he had just done. She knew the kind of man he was to the rest of the world. But as she looked at him, she didn't see a monster. She saw the man who had bought her daughter soup when the world had left them to freeze. Samuel looked away, ashamed, for the first time in his life, of the darkness he carried. It's done, he said softly. The Callahans are gone. You have the $2 million. It's clean. You and Lily can go wherever you want. I'll have Dominic set up new identities. Clara walked slowly toward him. The slate floor was cold beneath her bare feet. She stopped right in front of him, looking up into his dark, guarded eyes. I don't want to go, Clara whispered. Samuel's breath hitched. He looked down at her, seeing the fierce, unwavering loyalty in her gaze. Clara, I am not a good man. The world I live in, it's blood and shadows. I know, she said, reaching up to gently rest her hand against his chest, right over his racing heart. But you're our shield, and I'm tired of running. Samuel closed his eyes, a shudder running through his massive frame as he finally surrendered to the impossible warmth she offered. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tightly against him, burying his face in her chestnut curls. In that single embrace, the ruthless Mafia boss finally found his home. Months later, the heavy oak doors of Samuel's study were open. The afternoon sun bathed the room in a warm, golden glow. At the massive mahogany desk, Samuel sat reviewing shipping manifests. To his left, Clara was reading a book, her feet curled up on a leather armchair, a delicate diamond ring sparkling on her left hand. On the floor, Lily was aggressively coloring a picture of a dragon, her laughter ringing out clear and bright. Samuel set down his pen and looked at the corner of his desk. There, resting inside a custom-made, hermetically sealed glass frame, was a terribly crumpled, stained $1 bill, flanked by 4 dimes and 3 dull pennies. Samuel smiled, a genuine, quiet expression that the underworld of Chicago would never witness. He looked at Clara, who caught his gaze and smiled back, and then at the little girl who had marched up to the devil himself. He was the king of the city, a man of terrifying wealth and absolute power, but Samuel Russo knew the truth. His entire life, his entire soul, had been bought and paid for with exactly $1.43. The underworld of Chicago never forgot the night the Russo syndicate went to war over a bowl of soup. Samuel Russo remained a ruthless kingpin, but behind the bulletproof glass of his penthouse, he was simply a protector, a little girl's $1. 43 didn't just buy a meal, it bought an empire's absolute devotion, proving that sometimes the smallest change can rewrite the darkest destinies.